disconnected. We just read there an interaction between Solomon and one of the people which we'll be looking at tonight, that is Hiram, king of Tyre. Now, what I have pictured back here is a merchant trading vessel, the sort of vessel that you would have seen during the Bronze and Iron Ages. Now, in that story there between Solomon and Hiram, when you imagine the sort of sea vessels that would have transported these logs, you can sort of get the picture of a massive sort of maritime trading vessel like this, which was common among the Phoenician tribes. And so mentioning the Phoenician tribes, last week we covered the Canaanites. Those are all the tribes which are now grayed out for this week. We talked about how God set in place a time of judgment for them, how he gave them a certain amount of time, hundreds of years in fact, during that time where they could turn to him and have the chance to serve him. And then after that, Israel served as his tool of bringing judgment to the Canaanites. This week, though, we'll be looking at the other nations surrounding Israel. So this includes those that are not descendants or relatives of Abraham. So we have the Philistines, we have the Phoenicians, or also known as the Sidonians. We have the Syrians, who are also known as Arameans. And then we have the Kenites as well. And then we also have the descendants or relatives of Abraham. So these are the Edomites, who are the descendants of Esau. We have the Amalekites, who are also the descendants of Esau through his grandson Amalek. We have the Moabites, who are the descendants of Lot, and also the Ammonites, who are also the descendants of Lot. So starting off with the non-Abrahamic groups for tonight, specifically the Philistines. Now, the Philistines are a really interesting group of people because there is actually quite a bit of history on them before they even came into the land of, the modern-day land of Palestine. They were actually not native to the land of Israel, and instead they likely originated from islands in the Aegean region, which are pictured here. Now, the Aegean region is just east of Greece, north of Cyprus. It includes parts of Western Turkey as well, and they most likely came from Crete or Kaftor. And in fact, the Egyptians referred to them as the Peliset, which is actually where we get our modern day term for Palestine, Pelicetine. Now, they're also known to us through history as the Sea Peoples. Now, the Sea Peoples are really quite enigmatic. They are a group of people that migrated during the 1200 BCs, 1200s BC, and this included not just the Philistines or the Peliset, it included multiple groups of people. And these groups of people ended up raiding some of the largest empires around at the time of the Late Bronze Age. So these were the Hittite, the Mycenaean, and the Egyptian civilizations. And they actually led to what we know as the Bronze Age collapse, which I went into a bit last session. Now, the Peliset were a part of these Sea Peoples, and they migrated to the southern coast of Canaan, establishing cities like Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gath. Now, we do know that Abraham and Isaac actually interacted with people who were referred to as Philistines. Specifically, they interacted with either a certain person named Abimelech or multiple people with the title of Abimelech. But it seems like these were likely different people. If you look at the historical timelines, this was probably a different group of people who lived roughly in the same region as the Philistines would come to live in. And it's most likely that they just took on the name of what the future group would be called. Now, by the time of the wilderness wanderings, the Philistines had actually become a really powerful people. And this is because they had advanced military and also very advanced metallurgical technology. So they had the capability to create weapons which a lot of their contemporaries weren't able to. And this is quite important because during the time that the Philistines really came into the land, they, of course, destabilized being a part of the Sea Peoples, they destabilized a lot of the empires that were already present within that sort of region. And because of all that destabilization, their advanced military technology gave them a massive lead over a lot of the people within that region. Now, Joshua did not engage them directly during the conquest of Israel, but the Philistines later became one of Israel's fiercest adversaries and one of their most well-known ones as well. So how did the Philistines interact with Israel? So like I said, they were one of Israel's largest threats, especially during the times of the judges and the early monarchic period of Israel. And because of their ironworking skills and their military technology, they had a massive advantage over the Israelites. And we actually can read about this in 1 Samuel 13. It says, "Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, 'Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears.' So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened." So pretty much the Philistines created an iron monopoly within the region. And this meant that the Israelites could not go anywhere else aside from to the Philistines to get weapons made from bronze or iron. And this actually allowed them to maintain dominance over Israel for quite a long time. Eventually, though, Samson came along and he dealt a major, though this ended up being a temporary blow to their power. And he did this through, of course, destroying a temple. And this temple housed quite a few of their leaders. And then, of course, King Saul fought against them. We know the famous battle of David versus Goliath, but there were multiple other skirmishes around that time as well between King Saul and the Philistines. And eventually, King Saul died to the Philistines with his sons. And it wouldn't really be until King David's reign that their grip on Israel would begin to be loosened, as it was King David who repeatedly went against the Philistines and defeated them in battle, and he ended up being known as one of their worst enemies. Now, after this period, the Philistines did become less dominant within the land. They lost their monopoly on working with steel and iron because, especially during the time of King Solomon, trade opened up to a lot of the other regions surrounding Israel. So they lost a lot of their stranglehold over Israel. And yet, though less dominant, they did remain a threat to Israel and Judah after its split. King Jehoshaphat fought them in 2 Chronicles 17. And they also invaded Judah under King Jehoram. But by the 8th century BC, the Philistines came under pressure from empires like Assyria. Sargon II ended up subjugating their cities, and then he taxed them heavily. And then Nebuchadnezzar II, when he came along and conquered Assyria, he then assimilated the Philistines into his growing Babylonian empire. And then this continued during the Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman periods. So Gaza, Ashdod, and Ashkelon, although they remained key urban centers in the region for centuries after the fact, the Philistines had lost their distinct identity as a people. They had largely just been assimilated into the overall culture of the region. So getting into the Phoenicians, which was the group we read about a bit this morning, the Phoenicians are one of my favorite ancient peoples to research because they did a lot of trade. They actually spread far and wide throughout the world. In fact, there are reports of there being Phoenician artifacts found in the Americas, potentially. It's not fully proven yet, but it means they might have sailed that far by that point as well. We also know that they, of course, sailed to modern-day Britain, which was referred to as Tarshish. So they really had quite a broad reach around that region, and it's really interesting to look into their history. I would recommend it. But specifically, the Phoenicians lived along the Mediterranean coast in modern-day Lebanon, and these were in city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. And they were known for their maritime skills, their trade, and their craftsmanship. Specifically, they were known for creating a purple-red dye, which was made from shells. And this is actually potentially where the root of the word phoenix comes from. The Phoenicians were known for this purple-red dye, and likewise the phoenix was purpley and red in colour as well. So that's kind of a common link between those two words there. Now, Sidon was actually one of the cities in Phoenicia was founded by Canaan, and this was one of Noah's grandsons. They ended up establishing sea routes linking Egypt, Mesopotamia, Cyprus, and Crete. And they became a major player during the late Bronze Age and actually got mentioned quite a bit in Egyptian records. Now, a few of you might know of Carthage as well. I did mention it in the last session, but Carthage was actually a Phoenician colony which was founded by settlers from Tyre around 800 BC. And of course, Carthage ended up growing into a major power all in its own right and eventually opposed Rome. And the wars it fought against Rome were known as the Punic Wars. And that word there, Punic, actually comes from Phoenician, Punician. It's sort of a common root word for it. Now, the Phoenicians, as we read, eventually became key trade partners also with Israel. So King Hiram of Tyre allied himself with King David and King Solomon. He provided cedar wood, artisans, and materials for constructing the temple. And it seems like it was quite a close alliance as well. It wasn't just for the mutual benefit of both people. It seems like there was actually a connection between these rulers as well. But even though the Phoenicians did have some good connections with Israel, they also led to a bit of spiritual decline. So Jezebel, I'm sure you all know Jezebel, she was actually a Sidonian princess. And of course, Sidon was one of the cities in Phoenicia. She actually married King Ahab and introduced Baal worship to the nation of Israel. And it's a bit of an understatement there to say that it sparked religious conflict. It ended up being a big part of the reason why the nation of Israel went into a significant spiritual decline and ended up being conquered by the Assyrians. So now the decline of the Phoenicians. Phoenician city-states, although they were mainly focused on trade and not really on warfare, they were eventually just conquered by larger empires, such as the Assyrians in the 700s. Tyre specifically fell after a long siege by Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon in 586 BC. And then the rest of Phoenicia was conquered by the Persian Empire in 539 BC, and then the Greek Empire in 332 BC. Finally, Rome defeated Carthage in 146 BC. And although Carthage isn't a Phoenician city of sorts, it is based on Phoenician culture. It was kind of its own thing. But really, Carthage was the last vestige of Phoenicia in a way, and it had a major influence on the world. And so when Rome did defeat Carthage, it sort of marked the end of the Phoenicians as a people having any sort of influence on what was going on. And by the New Testament, Phoenicia was under Roman rule entirely, although Tyre and Sidon still held a bit of significance. And we do actually read about them in the New Testament as well, because there's accounts of Jesus speaking to Sidonians as well. Okay, so then we have the Syrians as well. Now, during the Bronze Age, far back in history, we know that the Syrians actually descended from Aram. Now, Aram was one of the sons of Shem. And this is why the Syrians actually get called as well sometimes the Arameans. They lived northeast of Canaan in regions which extended from the Orontes to the Euphrates River. Now, the Syrians during this time were mostly nomads, but gradually they settled in city-states like Damascus, which is the oldest still present city on earth, Hamath, Zobah, and Padan Aram. And in fact, Abraham's family had ties to Padan Aram. So both Sarah and Rebecca came from here, and Jacob also fled here as well and ended up marrying Rachel and Leah, who were also Syrians. Now, Syria during the Iron Age, by the time that Israel came into the land in the early Iron Age, the Syrians were a regional power, and they largely exerted force from Damascus, which was their most profitable and strongest city militarily. Now, we do read of multiple skirmishes between the Israelites and the Syrians. So King David defeated Syria at Zobar and also at Damascus, and he ended up making them vassals. And then we read that through the work of Hiram, Solomon actually was able to establish trade with Syria, and Syria provided metalworking, timber, stone, and horses. And this was around 950 BC. After Israel divided, though, hostilities with the Arameans resumed. During Ahab's reign, which was around 870 to 850 BC, Ben-Hadad ended up besieging Samaria, and he demanded very harsh tribute from Ahab. He said, "Your silver and your gold are mine. Your best wives and children also are mine." Now, these demands were so over the top that there was no way that Ahab could have accepted them. It was pretty much just Ben-Hadad saying, "We're planning to destroy you regardless. There's no way you can get out of this." So there obviously was a lot of hate between the nations of Syria and northern Israel at the time. And yet Yahweh stepped in and delivered Israel. Then, after being defeated, the Syrians believed that Israel's God was a God of the hills. And so their genius plan was to fight in the plains, because of course you can only be a god of the hills. You can't be a god of the plains as well. That's just not fair. And then Ben-Hadad attacked again. But then God delivered Israel once more and killed 100,000 of Ben-Hadad's men. Now, Ben-Hadad, to muster this massive fighting force of men, had to conscript not only from people within Syria, but he also made big trade deals with a lot of surrounding allies as well. So he ended up bringing a lot of people into this conflict. And so when he ended up losing this battle, it dealt a massive blow to Syria's strength overall. In fact, we read that several of Syria's allies after that point were no longer allies with Syria. They had been weakened so much, and they blamed Syria for losing. So Ben-Hadad ended up retreating to Aphek. And then the city walls collapsed on his army and killed even more of his men. But after these two defeats, Ahab ended up sparing Ben-Hadad's life, and he formed a treaty with him. Now, this ended up he ended up receiving condemnation from God for this. And for good reason. It's because Ahab didn't destroy them that the Syrians actually remained a massive thorn in Israel's side. Over time, they regained their strength. And then during Jehoram's reign, maybe about 30 years after Ben-Hadad, they ended up besieging Samaria again and causing severe famine. And God once more had to intervene to save the city. Then during the reign of Jehu and Jehoahaz, around 800 BC, King Hazael of Syria conquered much of northern Israel. So this dealt, of course, a massive blow to the northern tribes. But then Damascus was eventually conquered by the Assyrians in 732 BCE under Tiglath-Pileser III, and this ended Syrian independence. Syria ended up becoming part of the Assyrian, and then the Babylonian, and then the Persian empires, and then, of course, the Greek and Roman. And by the New Testament, although Syria was a Roman province, Damascus remained a significant urban center within the region. And it still is today. It still has around 2.5 million people living there. Now we get to the Kenites. The Kenites are also, I know I say every group's interesting, but they're kind of all interesting in their own way. The Kenites had quite close ties to the Israelites. Now, they were a nomadic group, and we can possibly trace their name back to Cain, though obviously they're not his descendants, as Cain was before the flood. Now, they are first mentioned in Abraham's time, and they lived in the region around southern Canaan, specifically the Negev and the Sinai regions. Now, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law and a Kenite priest, he, of course, welcomed Moses when Moses escaped from Egypt, and Moses ended up marrying his daughter. And he also advised him on governance as well. Now, after Israel left Egypt, a lot of the Kenites actually joined the Israelites. Many of them ended up settling with the tribe of Judah and lived peacefully with the southern tribes of Israel. Heber the Kenite played a key role in defeating Sisera. So his wife Jael ended up killing the Canaanite commander in Judges. Now, we see that all throughout Israel's history, the relationship between the Kenites and the Israelites stayed pretty warm. So during King Saul's campaign against the Amalekites, he actually warned the Kenites to leave Amalekite territory to avoid harm. Then Saul said to the Kenites, depart, go down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the people of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. And it seems like by the late monarchic period, around 200 to 300 years after King Saul, the Kenites had largely integrated into Judah through intermarriage. They're not really mentioned much after this point, and it's probably just because they ended up losing their distinct identity as a people. Now, it's interesting because in Numbers 24, God actually has a prophecy about the Kenites. He says, "Enduring is your dwelling place, and your nest is set in the rock. Nevertheless, Cain shall be burned when Asher takes you away captive." And so we actually see that the Assyrian conquest of Judah likely marked the end of the Kenites. So this was when the Assyrians really pushed up into Judah and ended up taking most of the cities aside from Jerusalem. Now we get into the descendants and the relatives of Abraham. So we have the Edomites, who were in this region here, southeast of the land of Israel. Now, they were descendants of Esau, Jacob's brother, and they were actually named after the red stew that Esau traded his birthright for, or either that or the red hair that Edom had, that Esau had. And this is because red in Hebrew is Edom or Adam. So they settled in Seir, which is southeast of Judah. Now, the land of Seir has really rugged terrain, and this makes it really hard to invade that land as well. And Seir is also known for having quite strong ore deposits, specifically copper. And so they actually were able to form quite a strong position because they were positioned on major trade routes. They ended up thriving in copper trade. And they end up getting mentioned in Egyptian sources as the Shasu of Seir. And we also have archaeological evidence from Tel El Khalifa, which supports their existence and also their economic strength at the time. They also had key cities known as Bozrah and Sela, and they had a monarchy before Israel. And that's something which is specifically pointed out to us in Genesis. Now, Edom had a tumultuous relationship with Israel, and this was partially due to the promise that Isaac gave to Esau. So Isaac said to him, "Away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother, but when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck." And if we look at Edomite history, it matches this one-to-one. Saul and David both fought against the Edomites, and David ended up gaining control over them. But then over the later decades, Edom ended up regaining their independence. Now, the Assyrians and Babylonians also interacted with Edom. And one of the most notable interactions was when Edom assisted the Babylonians in destroying Jerusalem, which God actually promised to punish them for. "Because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever." But it's interesting, even though Edom, of course, led to a lot of the destruction of the people of Judah, they also allied quite often with the people of Judah as well. So, of course, their relationship was marked by a lot of alliances with Israel, but also a lot of fighting as well. And then after Babylon's conquest in 586 BC, the Edomites ended up expanding into southern Judah and the Negev. And by BC 300, the Edomites had fully migrated into southern Judah, and they actually became known as the Idumeans. Now, the Idumeans were forcibly converted to Judaism by the Hasmonean king, John Hyrcanus, and the Hasmoneans were a group of Israelite people who came back to the land after being separated from the land. Now, Herod the Great, an Idumean, one I'm sure a lot of you recognize this name, he was actually made king of Judea, the Roman region, by the Romans in 37 BC. And he was a practicing Jew. He was known for renovating the Second Temple, but he's more famously, or infamously, I should say, known for his brutality and his massacre of Bethlehem, where he tried to find where Jesus was born and ended up killing many children in Bethlehem. Now, the Edomites, or the Idumeans, gradually disappeared from history. So after the Jewish-Roman Wars of 66 to 135 AD, the region of Idumea was vastly depopulated, and they ended up vanishing almost entirely by AD 200. Now, the next group of people are the Amalekites. The Amalekites are actually known as Israel's greatest enemy. They are also descendants of Esau, specifically his grandson Amalek. And they lived in the Negev and Sinai Peninsula, and they were mainly raiders and nomads within this area. Now, during Israel's exodus, the Amalekites actually attacked Israel at Rephidim. And then Israel under Moses and Joshua defeated them. I'm sure a lot of you remember the story where Moses had to hold up a staff, and as long as he kept holding it up, the Israelites would win. God, after this, declared that he would blot out the memory of Amalek, and this ended up marking a long-standing enmity between them and Israel. The Amalekites continued to harass Israel during the time of the judges. They continually raided settlements and destroyed crops. Now, Gideon actually defeated an alliance of Amalekites and also Midianites with just 300 men. Then, under King Saul, God commanded Israel to completely obliterate the Amalekites for their repeated attacks against Israel. And while Saul did defeat them in battle, he ended up sparing King Agag, and he kept livestock. Now, as a result of this, he lost God's favor, and then Samuel instead killed Agag. We also know that during the time of David, the Amalekites ended up raiding his city of Ziklag. So they captured David's family and his men. David ended up pursuing, defeating them, and rescuing the captives. And we can actually sort of track how Amalekite power really weakened during this time. So, of course, King Saul nearly obliterated them. After this point, they were probably much weaker, more just focused on raiding, and so that's why they would have raided David's city of Ziklag and tried to escape as quickly as they can. So they weren't really a powerful group of people at this time. And we know that they were significantly weakened after this point, as they are only mentioned later as being a remnant of the Amalekites in 1st of Chronicles. And yet, despite this, the memory that the Israelites had over the intense hatred that the Amalekites had for them and all of the constant warfares made them remain as a symbol as the enemies of God and Israel. We read in Esther that Haman the Agagite, whether this means he's a descendant of Agag or this is a symbolical callback to Agag, he sought to annihilate the Jews entirely throughout the Persian Empire. But God, through Esther, ended up thwarting his plans. And we also know of the Ammonites and Moabites. These were descendants of Lot, not through good means though. This was through incest with his daughters after Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction, when they ended up giving him lots of wine to drink. They ended up settling past the Jordan, so the Moabites settled in the fertile land east of the Dead Sea, while the Ammonites settled further northeast with their capital at Rabbah. Now, the Moabites and Ammonites revered Chemosh and Molech, and these are both terrible gods. They are both associated with child sacrifice. And they also greatly opposed Israel coming back into the land. As Israel approached Canaan, King Balak of Moab hired Balaam to curse Israel, but God ended up turning this into a blessing. Later, they tried a different tactic, and Moab ended up enticing Israel into idolatry and immorality, and they ended up being punished by God for this. And the Ammonites as well didn't offer the Israelites safe passage through their land and tried to stop them from getting back into Canaan. And then during the time of the judges, both nations oppressed Israel quite heavily. So Moab, under King Eglon for 18 years, reigned over Israel. This was until Ehud assassinated him, and we read of the story where he stabbed a dagger into Eglon and it sank all the way into his stomach because he was a very big man. And then we also read of the Ammonites, how they continually skirmished against Israel's eastern tribes. The Ammonites actually tried to claim that the Israelites had wronged them. So they said that when the Israelites were coming back into the land, they had taken Ammonite territory unlawfully, which didn't happen. The Israelites never took Ammonite land. They did take Amorite land, and of course the Amorites were part of the Canaanite tribes Israel was told to conquer, but this was because the Amorites attacked Israel first. And so they were essentially just trying to get land that wasn't theirs. And then Jephthah ended up stopping them. We also read that David defeated Moab and imposed harsh tribute on them. But he didn't do this to the Ammonites. Instead, he tried to show kindness to the Ammonites. And this was because he had past friendships with several of them. And I will go into that a little bit later. And so when the Ammonite king died, he was good friends with the Ammonite king. And so he sent words of consolation to the new king after his father died. But this new king, instead of taking these words and the friendship of David, he ended up dishonoring David's messengers through shaving their body just on one side. And then even after this, David wasn't going to declare war on the Ammonites. He wasn't interested in that. He was ashamed at the fact that the king had spat in his face, essentially, by dishonoring his messengers, but he was going to let bygones be bygones. And yet we then read that the king of Ammon looked at this and he then pretty much said, oh, David's not going to forgive me for doing that. I'm going to declare war. And so he declared war. This forced David to fight back, and he ended up defeating the Ammonites. Then as Israel weakened, gradually of course, Israel split. Moab and Ammon ended up regaining their independence, and they joined in various coalitions against Israel. But eventually, it should be a common theme by now, they ended up being overrun by Syria, Babylon, and Persia. And then they largely disappear from the historical record. So tonight, I've pretty much been going through a lot of the bad actions that these groups of people did. There were, of course, good highlights with the Kenites, with the Phoenicians, with the early interactions between the Syrians and the Israelites. But there's actually quite a few good examples of people from these nations. And it is really interesting because God says that they shall never enter my courts. He says, no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and with water on the way when you came out of Egypt. And because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. But the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam. Instead, the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loved you. You shall not seek their peace or their prosperity all your days forever. So that is a scathing remark from God there, saying that no Ammonite or Moabite, no descendant of Ammonites or Moabites will ever be able to enter the assembly of the Lord. So let's see if that holds. Now, we do have some smaller figures. Obadiah, there is a book, of course, the book of Obadiah. He was most likely an Edomite prophet, and he was faithful to God and ended up recording a prophecy against Edom for their actions. We also know of Shobi. Shobi was the son of Nahash and was an Ammonite. And this was one of the people I was talking about earlier that King David was friends with from the Ammonite tribes. He is remembered for his kindness towards David during his flight from Absalom. When Absalom took over the kingdom and David was forced to flee, Shobi ended up giving shelter to David and gave food to him as well. And despite the hostilities between Israel and Ammon, Shobi ended up being a great friend to David. Like I said earlier as well, Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, helped Israel by killing Sisera, the commander of the Canaanite army. And I really want to focus in on two other specific people from these nations as well. The first one is Naaman. Naaman was a commanding figure in the Syrian army. And although initially a pagan who didn't want anything to do with God really, he ended up seeking healing from the God of Israel, all because his little Israelite handmaid ended up, or his wife's Israelite handmaid ended up telling him to go to Israel. Now, Naaman was, of course, hesitant and prideful. He expected grand gestures for his healing. He thought he'd have to go on a massive quest like you read in the Greek Odysseys. He thought he'd have to fight a griffin or something. But he was just instructed to simply wash in the Jordan River. And although he laughed at this, he said, this isn't going to work. He ended up humbling himself and obeyed Elisha's direction. And he was cured of his leprosy. And because of his healing, it led him to confess faith in the God of Israel. He actually said, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. And so even though the Syrians and the Israelites were at great odds against each other for a lot of their history, especially during this time, this was, of course, during the time of Elisha and Ahab. So, of course, the Syrians were not good friends with Ahab at this time, to say the least. And we also have Ruth as well. Now, Ruth, I'm sure, is a lot of people's favorite characters in this room. And although the Moabites were Israel's enemies, and like I said, they were forbidden from entering the assembly of the Lord, Ruth showed tremendous devotion to God and his people. After the death of her husband, she famously declared to Naomi that your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And her journey of faith led her to marry Boaz, an Israelite. And we actually read in the story of Ruth right at the end where Boaz is asking one of Naomi's closer relatives whether he wants to marry Ruth. He says no way, because if he married a Moabite, he believed that, of course, his children would never be able to enter the assembly of the Lord. It would be a blot on his name and on his descendants for the rest of history. And yet this didn't stop Boaz. He ended up marrying Ruth, and she later became the great-grandmother of King David, and she also is in the lineage of Jesus Christ. And so reconciling those two facts, that no Moabite descendant is ever allowed into the assembly of the Lord, and the fact that Jesus and David and all of David's descendants are technically Moabite descendants, it's a bit interesting to consider that David, who is a descendant of Ruth, not only entered the assembly, but later became the king of Israel, and that Jesus himself was born from this lineage. And so the major lesson for us is that God's ultimate plan is about faith. It's about repentance and redemption, rather than strict adherence to the law. Anyone, regardless of whatever background you have, can become part of his divine plan, so long as you seek him with sincerity and faith. And the contradiction between the commandment in Deuteronomy and the fact that Ruth, a Moabite, is in Jesus' lineage, it demonstrates really to us, or it should, that the law was never the end goal. As we read, the law was a tutor meant to lead people to Christ. And then Christ would fulfill the law, and yet he'd be condemned by it, bearing its curse on the cross. And so the lesson of Ruth and I guess all the surrounding nations of Israel is that anyone can come into the assembly of God. and that the law alone cannot bring salvation. And it's only through Christ, the fulfillment of the law, that true redemption can be achieved. And so in the last two sessions, I've hopefully shown you that although the Canaanites and all the other surrounding nations around Israel, although, of course, they were Gentiles, they weren't followers of God generally, all of them had the chance to come and worship God and serve him, just like we've been able to in our own lives.